Chapter 4. As Perry had gotten into the cruiser with his friend L.T. Anderson, he had looked back. Looking back at a place where he and his family had always felt safe. There had been family gatherings, Christmas parties, times with his best friend Paul and his family. Now all that had changed in just a few moments. The gunman had only been actively shooting for perhaps a minute or two and had killed and wounded several. L.T. Anderson was on his way to the hospital. This was a very bad situation. There had been at least 2 confirmed dead and one had been one of his men. The police officer had died outside of the building in a virtual shootout with the 2 gunmen. A young rookie had been wounded and had been traumatized as he had tried to save the life of his partner. Now, the cruiser was dropping his friend and sometimes challenge, always that is, in the courtroom to pick up his car. His friend now had the challenge of going over to Paul Drake's house and picking up his wife. Paul was in critical condition and going to be undergoing surgery, if he could be stabilized. Perry watched as he came to his parking garage, jumped out of the cruiser and nodded his head to his friend. He had his keys in his hand and jumped into his car. As he drove the short distance to his friend's house, he worried. He knew that his ability to keep a non-emotional steady face was going to be a very difficult thing on this horrible evening, but he needed to be strong for Sue. Sally had settled down to watch her favorite television show when the breaking news had come on. Her mom was in the office working once again and her little brother was playing over in the corner of the room. She was older than her little brother and knew right away that her daddy and Uncle Paul, as she knew him, were at the lodge where the man on the television said there had been a shooting with several people shot and at least 1 confirmed death. Della had gone back to the office to finish her work when Sally had come running in. Sally had always knocked and her running in the door was a surprise. But, the terror on her little girl's face said volumes. "Mommy, something bad has happened at the lodge," was all she said. At that moment Della reached over and turned on the television. Right there in front of her eyes she saw the lodge. There were police everywhere. There were ambulances and a crowd of people that looked as though they were in shock, talking to the officers and with others standing around. Della searched the crowd hoping to see that Paul and Perry were all right, desperately hoping for the best. For Sally this was another nightmare. She had lost her first parents, as she called them. Her other mommy and daddy had died in a car accident. She didn't want to go through that again and she clung to her new mom. Her eyes were filled with tears as she searched for her daddy. But, there he was getting into a police cruiser with his friend Mr. Anderson. But, where was Uncle Paul? Della looked on as she saw Perry, but no Paul. She had just taken a deep breath when the phone rang. She ran to the phone with worry and hope in her mind. Perry was his way to Sue's house when he called his wife to let her know what had happened. Paul's wife Sue was going to need the support of her best friend Della, and at this moment he needed her with him also. He reached over to give her a call. As Sally and Della stood there in the office watching in horror the scene that was unfolding in front of them, the phone rang. Della nearly jumped out of her skin as she reached for the phone. To her relief it was Perry. He sounded upset and shaken, but he was okay. She smiled down at Sally and said, "It's Daddy, he's all right." Sally was still crying, not just for her daddy, but for the people who had been there. They were her friends and the man on the TV had said that someone had died. "Della, I am sorry to tell you that Paul has been injured. He is alive, but critical. I am on my way to his house to pick up Sue. Can you meet us at the Genesis Center? That is where they have taken him." Perry asked her. "Of course, I am on my way." Della knew by the tone and by the sound of the speed of his car that things were bad. But, she smiled at Sally and said, "I have to go to the hospital. Uncle Paul has been hurt. He is being taken care of right now. I promise as soon as I know anything I will let you know." Karen had just gone upstairs to her room and turned on the television when she saw the news. It hit her like a ton of bricks. These were people she knew. So many times she had been there with the Masons, and now this. She had gone downstairs to see what she could do to help when Della came out of the office. I am on my way to the Genesis Center. Paul has been injured, Della said. With that she watched as Della ran out the street. She stood there holding Sally, who was just wide-eyed and horrified. Perry Jr. came into the room and just looked. He was too young to understand, but even as a 3-year-old he knew something bad had happened. Paul Jr. had been upstairs in his room watching his favorite show when the news came on. He watched in horror as he saw all those people being taken into ambulances. There were lots of police, and the man on the TV said that one had been killed. Where was his daddy? He yelled to his mom as he ran down the stairs to the living room. Sue grabbed her son and hugged him as they watched the TV in terror together. 1,000 thoughts were coming into Sue Drake's mind. Where was Paul? Why was Perry getting into the police cruiser alone? Was someone going to call her? She just didn't know. She picked up her phone and called Paul. There was no response, and it had gone to his answering service. She was about to call Della and see if she had heard anything when she heard a car pull into the driveway. Sue looked out the front window and saw Perry walking up to the door. She felt a lump in her throat as the look on his face said it all. She opened the door and met Perry. She held on to him as he said, "I am sorry, Paul has been injured." Chapter 5. Sue looked over to see her son Paul's face. The terror on his face said it all. She instinctively knew that he needed to come with her. He was young, but this was his dad. But Paul Jr. spoke up first. "I am coming with you," he said with a firmness that told both Perry and Sue that he meant what he said. Perry took him by the shoulder and with his big loving arms held each of them close as they hurried to his waiting car. The ride to the hospital was tense, and as Perry hurried down the street he wondered how his friend was doing. He knew that the news coverage was going to be vast, and curious spectators were going to make a difficult time even more difficult. As they approached the Genesis Center, Sue and Perry could see the news people. There were police everywhere, and as they approached the emergency room they were stopped by the police. The officer recognized the man behind the wheel of the car and motioned him on. He had heard of Perry Mason and his friend. He had also heard that his friend Paul Drake was badly wounded. Just a moment, a blink in time, and so many lives were changed on this very night. What a waste of life, he thought to himself as he watched the car pull into the parking lot. As the three friends hurried into the waiting room at the emergency department, they were overwhelmed by the amount of people who were huddling around, some crying, some pacing, and some just staring. Everyone was in shock, and the line to the desk to get any information was long. It was then that he saw Hamilton Berger coming into the room. Berger was a tall man with a stern face, dark hair, and a strong body. He was in his 40s and lived just a block away from the Masons. His brother lived next door, and even though when the two men were in the courtroom they could have some major differences outside of court, they were friends. Hamilton Berger was an elected district attorney and had been at a meeting when he had heard the news of the shooting. There were at least 3 dead at this point and chaos everywhere. He looked around at the crowd and saw Perry Mason and Sue Drake standing in the corner with Paul Drake Jr. He had heard of Paul and his heroic attempt at stopping the gunman. He was sad to hear that Paul was not doing well. Perry walked towards his friend and the two men shook hands. Hamilton knew that Mason would want the truth, good or bad, and he thought of Paul. Paul Drake had been an acquaintance of Hamilton's for years. They had become friends slowly, and Hamilton was sincerely worried about his friend. "Perry, this is bad. I have 2 dead officers, 2 seriously injured officers, and a rookie who has been shot in the foot. Inside the lodge there were 8 people shot, including Paul. 3 were dead at the scene and 1 just died a few minutes ago." It was just as Perry had worried. The death count could be going up, and he had still not heard about his friend Paul. "Have you heard anything about Paul?" he asked. But, before Hamilton could say anything, a lady came into the room and called out, "I am looking for the family of Paul Drake." Sue had been waiting with her son and watching Perry and Hamilton. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she was sure that Hamilton hadn't heard any more than Perry at this moment by the two men's body movements. It was then that she heard the nurse call to her. Della had driven like a mad lady to the hospital. She had been allowed into the parking lot to find no parking spaces. She made the best of it and parked her car on the lawn. There were several other cars doing the same and she shook her head. She ran up the stairs to the emergency room and walked into utter chaos. There were people everywhere. But, there in the corner sat her friend Sue Drake and her son Paul. She ran over to her and gave her a hug. She looked up to see Perry talking to Hamilton Berger. Paul Jr. watched in horror as he looked into the crowd of scared faces. People were crying, some were just staring and some were trying to do things to keep the young occupied. There was a mime trying to entertain them, but he was in no mood to do anything, but just sit there and wait. As he heard his family name called out, he jumped up. Perry once again took Sue and Paul Jr. in his arms and walked over to the lady. Della had Paul Jr.'s hand and she held it tight. The nurse was a very friendly woman who smiled as she took them into a small room. "Dr. Dean would like to speak to you. He will be right in." Dr. Dean had been a medical doctor for over 10 years and specialized in gunshot wounds. He had seen it all when he was in Vietnam and as he had worked the hospitals in Chicago before moving to LA. He had seen victims like Paul pull through and some who did not. Paul was being prepped for surgery and he would know when the surgery was done. He walked the walk he had walked too many times before. The walk to meet the family of the victim. The four friends looked up to see the doctor come into the room. He had a kind face, but what he had to say cut through each of them like a knife. Dr. Dean looked directly at Sue Drake as he told her as kindly as he could, "Your husband is alive, but he has lost a lot of blood and is going to need immediate surgery. He is on his way up to the operating room right now. The wound to his arm is treatable and not life-threatening, but in the abdomen the damage has been severe. I will not know everything until I operate." Sue found that she could hardly breathe when she asked, "Can we see him?" "For just a moment. He is not conscious, but he might be aware that you are in the room. We never know until the patient wakes up whether or not they are aware of their surroundings," Dr. Dean told the group. The four friends were led into a small room where they could see Paul lying on a cot. He had FORS and oxygen. He was hooked to a respirator who was breathing for him. His color was gray and as Sue came over to him she took his hand. His hand was cold and had little if no sign of life. She whispered "I love you" to her husband and then looked longingly into her friend's eyes. Paul Jr. looked down at his dad and wanted to shout, "Wake up!" But he knew that his dad couldn't. "Daddy, we can't wait to see you and take you home. Everything will be okay." He choked on his words and fell into his mom's arms. Perry and Della just stood there and held their friends. Each one of them came over to Paul and watched as the doctors and nurses did their best to help the severely injured man. The four friends stood together as they watched their friend being taken down the hall to the operation that they all hoped would save his life. Chapter 6. The five friends watched until they could no longer see their friend. There was a waiting room, but it was already filled with other families who were now facing the same fate. Not only had there been gunshot victims, but there had been an automobile accident involving a family who had been speeding to get to the hospital to find out the fate of their injured family member. There were also many people who were in shock and they heard of a man who had a heart attack. Lt. Anderson was standing inside the lodge where the terror had begun. He stood in the middle of the room and watched his men as they combed through every single piece of paper, anything that might give them a clue as to what had happened and why. He walked over to the office. There had been security cameras turned on during the shooting and they were now in the process of reviewing the tape. As the men did the first review of each and every tape, it became apparent that the two men had known about the cameras and their location. In several instances the gunman could be seen, but at no time was their face exposed. If the lab couldn't pick out their face, he and the other police officers were going to have to go by the description that people who had been there would give them. This was the worst case scenario as it had happened so quickly and most of the people would have varying memories and their descriptions could vary widely. There were now 5 dead victims and the car accident. One of the sisters of a victim had been hurrying over to the hospital when she had run a red light. The car had been hit hard in the driver's side door and the doctors said it did not look good. There had been 3 children in the car also and 2 were now listed as critical. Once the shooters were located they would be charged with that, he hoped. Hamilton Berger had a list of people who had witnessed the carnage firsthand. Many of them were professionals, but he thought of his friend Perry Mason. Mason had an amazing memory and a keen sense about him. He knew that Paul had gone into surgery and that he could find his friend at the hospital. Perry was standing outside in the corridor worrying about his friend when he saw Hamilton Berger approaching him. He had done nothing but think about what had happened ever since the men had opened fire that night. The bustling in the hallway and the cries of the family members bounced off the walls and the smell of the cleaning fluids were overwhelming. He did not want to leave very far, but he could use the excuse to go with Hamilton. Perry looked at his friend and said, "Hold on Hamilton, I need to tell Della and Sue where I will be." With that he went into the crowded room and told Della and Sue that he would be outside the exit door just down the hallway if any news came. Dr. Dean was just starting surgery when he realized just how bad the wound Paul had received was. Although the bullet had missed his heart, it had struck his lung. The lung was filled with blood and would need extensive work. The bullet had also severed his spinal cord. If this man was to live, he was going to be paralyzed from the chest down at best. But he was there to try and save the man's life. He had a wonderful family who was waiting for him. There was a perforation that Dr. Dean was busy trying to locate that was bleeding profusely. As he sewed one injury, another one showed up. He was putting blood into the man as fast as possible and he was losing the battle. Clamp after clamp, suture after suture, and he was still bleeding. Sue had tried to call Paul's parents but had gotten no answer. She was wondering where they could be and if they heard anything about the shooting. She once again was in line at the payphone getting ready to make a phone call to them when she saw Paul's parents coming down the hall. The police had come to their house and informed them about what had happened. The worry on their faces spoke volumes. Lori had been at home when she had seen on the television what had happened. She saw Perry getting into a police car, and wondered where her sister was. She had reached right over and called Della right away, but got Karen. Her heart fell when Karen told her about Paul. She had been friends with the Drakes for years and Paul was very much like a brother to her. She thought about going to the hospital, but she knew that the hospital would be overcrowded and didn't need anyone new arriving. So she just sat on the couch worried and then called her parents. The Streets had just climbed into bed, as they lived in the Midwest and there was a 2-hour time difference when the phone had rang. It was Della and she had called to tell them that their son was all right, but Paul had been shot. They knew how close their daughter and her husband were to Paul and they felt very sorry for what had happened. They had met the man several times and were very fond of him. It would be a long night of no sleep and worry at the street home. Hamilton and Perry stood outside of the hospital and Hamilton was studying Perry's face. Although his friend was very worried about Paul, he was managing to keep his composure as he started to recount the shooting. Perry had been mulling it over in his head over and was kicking himself because of his lack of clarity. He had made his career out of his ability to recall things with detail and this was the most important deposition that he had ever made. Personally, he hoped that it was the most important one he would ever have to make. Dr. Dean worked tirelessly on Paul and after 2 hours, he had not made much progress. Paul's heartbeat was now irregular to the point where it could no longer sustain life. He was losing this man and he knew it. That evening at 10:46 p.m. Paul Drake was pronounced dead. His heart couldn't take the massive damage and lack of oxygen that it had sustained. The doctor gave CPR internally for 20 minutes before giving up. Paul never woke up.